It feels like ever since I got into the NBA, the West has always been the supreme conference compared to the East. And the main reason for that is, it's quite simply true. The Eastern Conference has had teams under 500 make the playoffs 11 times since the turn of the century, while it's happened 0 times out West. Throughout this period of dominance, there have been some absurdly stacked conferences over the years, with 2010, 14, and 16 being standouts. However, there is still one year in my eyes that reigns supreme as maybe the most competitive conference I've ever seen, and that's 2008, with this being one of the only times in NBA history where all 8 teams in the playoffs won 50 plus games. I want to go back and take a look at each team that qualified, see how they ended up in the spot that they did, and why finishing at the top and making it out of this gauntlet was one of the greatest accomplishments of Kobe Bryant's career. Before we even get into the teams that made it, I want to give a quick mention to those that didn't make the playoffs. Just 1 year after their incredible We Believe run where they upset the 67-win Mavericks, the Warriors actually improved their record by 6 games in 2008, as they were a respectable 48-34. However, this conference was so good that it wasn't even enough to get into the postseason that year. Even the 10-seed Trailblazers broke even at 41-41. For reference, winning 37 games was good enough to get you into the playoffs in the East this season, and the 10-seeded Nets won just 34 games to Portland's 41. This makes even reaching the playoffs in the West this year so much more impressive. With over half the conference including very good teams that won 50 games, there were also 2 additional teams on the outside that were at the very least competent. There were really no days off in the West. As the very last team that stuck into the playoffs, the Denver Nuggets did in fact have a lot of typical traits that you see in fringe playoff teams. They were undoubtedly talented, as they had 2 of the best scorers in the league with Carmelo Anthony and Allen Iverson, an elite defensive anchor in Marcus Camby, and formidable supporting pieces in J.R. Smith and Kenyon Martin. However, the pieces just didn't mesh together as perfectly as you might have expected, and the bulk of the offense was just Melo and AI taking turns. For some teams, an ISO-heavy offense usually results in a trip straight to the lottery, but with the overwhelming talent of Melo and AI, they were good enough to remain competitive and win 50 games. They matched up with the 1-seeded Lakers in the first round, where they were convincingly swept. Winning 50 games is normally enough to signify that a team's going to make some noise in the playoffs, but this year was going to require much more than just talent and offensive firepower. Even though they weren't the lowest seed, the Mavericks in my opinion were the worst of the 8 playoff teams in the West this season. But that's not to say that they were bad by any means. They brought back pretty much every important piece from the 2007 squad that won 67 games, but it still seemed like something was inherently broken after they lost as the 1 seed in the first round the season prior. They tried to shake things up by making a midseason trade for Jason Kidd, giving Dallas their best point guard since Steve Nash. Despite the flashy headline of the move, the Mavs went just 16-13 with Kidd in the lineup, finishing the season with 51 wins and entering the playoffs as a 7 seed. And just like the year before where a dynamic point guard tore them apart, the team had no answer for Chris Paul, as the 2-seed Hornets disposed of them in 5 games. Now, I'm not saying that the West all of a sudden had 6 other teams catch up to the Mavs and reach a 60-plus win level, but Dallas wasn't that much worse compared to what they were in 07. Their decline was just much more evident as the rest of the conference was overall at such a high level. With the other teams around them getting that much better, the Mavs actually fired their coach Avery Johnson after this season, signifying that winning 50-plus games is not enough to keep your job in the West. This is the last team of the playoff picture that wasn't seen as more of anything than a long shot in terms of doing anything. But it didn't start that way. Through the first 50 games of the season, the Phoenix Suns were the 1st seed in the Western Conference. But in an effort to shake up their roster and try and become a more formidable roster for the postseason, they traded Shawn Marion, their defensive Swiss Army knife, for a 36-year-old Shaquille O'Neal. I do get why Phoenix made this deal. Amari Stoudemire was playing out of position at the 5, and on paper, this move gave them more of a chance to compete against the big front courts like the Lakers, Spurs, and Rockets. However, Shaq was nothing more than damaged goods at this point in his career, and an injured, 7-foot, 300-plus pound center wasn't the ideal fit for Phoenix's fast-paced offense. But it isn't like the Suns were just a complete afterthought. Shaq was healthy enough for the playoffs, and he was expected to be a tough matchup for the 3-seeded Spurs led by Tim Duncan, but it just didn't work out in their favor. Phoenix lost in a swift but very competitive 5-game series, and it ended up raising some questions regarding what they were going to do long-term with Shaq as a focal point of this team. Like the Suns, the Rockets were an extremely talented and flawed team that still put together a great season, finishing up with 55 wins just like Phoenix. But their season went very differently compared to Nash's squad. Houston entered the season with Rick Adelman as their new head coach, and they kind of struggled out of the gates, starting at just 24-20. However, the team slowly started to figure things out, going on an extremely impressive 12-game winning streak. On February 26th, they received the crushing news that Yao Ming was going to be out for the remainder of the year with a broken foot. While this is usually enough to derail a team's season, the Rockets won an additional 10 straight games following Yao's absence, absolutely crushing teams by an average of nearly 15 points per night. Of course, this team's ceiling was much lower with the corpse of Dikembe Mutombo as their starting center instead of Yao Ming, but the back half of this winning streak showed that they still had more than enough to compete with any team in the conference, as they only finished 2 games back of the 1 seed. However, they really drew the short end of the stick in terms of seeding, as they wound up against a super underrated Jazz team who beat them in 6 games, who we'll be talking more about next. Even though they finished 1 game worse than the Rockets and Suns with 54 wins, the Jazz were ahead of both of these teams in the standings in 2008 because of a dumb rule that guaranteed a top 4 seed to any team that won their division. Despite the inferior record though, this Utah team was absolutely legit, so much so that many people picked them to be the ones who would come out of the West this year. Unlike Phoenix and Houston, whose rosters were either improperly constructed or hampered by injuries, Utah was an extremely competent, well-coached, and healthy team that was clicking on all cylinders heading into the playoffs. After coaching Stockton and Malone, head coach Jerry Sloan knew exactly how to utilize the tandem of Darren Williams and Carlos Boozer, leading to them both earning All-NBA selections this season. With those two complemented by a super solid supporting cast, they had a much more dominant season than their record suggested. From January 1st onwards, Utah went 37-12, with plenty of signature wins included. They beat the Celtics by 18 in Boston, handing them their worst loss of the season, had 2 20-point victories over the Hornets, a 26-point victory over the Spurs, and a 24-point victory over the Lakers during the stretch. I feel like most fans either don't remember or weren't around for these late 2000s Utah teams, but I promise you Williams and Boozer were legit stars during their prime and consistently had their team in contention. They would handle the Rockets in 6 games before eventually falling to the Lakers in the conference semis. But with the West being as close as it was, as well as the fact that them winning their division brought them to the Lakers side of the bracket, things just didn't work out in their favor this season. Coming in at number 3, we have the defending champions, the San Antonio Spurs. After just playing all the way through June the season prior while being the oldest team in the entire NBA, San Antonio unfortunately did not have the luxury of being able to coast through the regular season and gear up for another playoff push. With the conference being as tight as it was, they needed every advantage they could get, and this led to the team not being able to pump the brakes at any point throughout 2008. Led by the usual trio of Parker, Ginobili, and Duncan, they finished with 56 wins. As we mentioned, the Spurs took care of the Suns in 5 games in the first round, but it wasn't the easy 5-game series you might expect. There were plenty of people who thought the Suns were going to make a deep playoff run, and that it was their time to finally beat San Antonio, but Popovich and crew still had their number at this moment. Up next was the young and hungry New Orleans Hornets. With MVP candidate Chris Paul, New Orleans had San Antonio on the ropes early, jumping out to a 2-0 series lead. After fighting back to even the series, they once again fell down 3-2 before coming back and winning a Game 7 on the road. More on this series in a moment. At this point though, San Antonio is absolutely exhausted. Combine that with Manu playing on an ankle injury, limiting his production, as well as this infamous no-call in Game 4, San Antonio fell to the Lakers in 5 games, failing once again to repeat. In most other seasons, they probably would have had more legs under them heading into the conference finals, and could have put up a better fight against Los Angeles. But this season in particular just required so much more to get through each round. And with them being as old as they were, it was just not meant to be in 2008 for them. Up until Chris Paul finally joined some elite teams like the Rockets and the Suns later on in his career, this was seen as one of the only true contenders that he was ever on. In just his 3rd year, CP3 ascended into superstardom status in 2008, truly cementing himself as the best point guard in the league. Not only did he make his first All-Star and All-NBA appearance this season, he also finished 2nd in MVP voting. Flanking the young superstar was the very underrated David West, Tyson Chandler, and Peja Stojakovic. While this isn't the most glamorous supporting cast, as a whole, they were super steady. Unsurprisingly, the team had the 2nd best turnover rate, gave up the fewest fouls, and was the 2nd best rebounding team in the league. All around just super solid. This was the first season that the Hornets returned to New Orleans after being relocated for 2 seasons due to Hurricane Katrina. With their surprising success, the city rallied around the team and was a true feel-good story. With that in mind, along with the fact that they were healthier than pretty much any other contender in the West, it almost seemed like it was written in the stars that they would be the ones who would make it out of the conference. It definitely seemed that way after they made quick work of the Mavs, and they went up 2-0 on the Spurs. But this would end up being one of many blown series from Chris Paul teams throughout his career, as they would end up losing a heartbreaking Game 7 on their home floor. Ultimately, they just didn't have the championship experience that San Antonio had, and that's what ended up costing them this year. Looking back, it's kind of ridiculous to expect a team that had 0 playoff experience coming into the season to run the table in their first real postseason run. But it really did feel like anything could have happened this year, and it almost did. finally, we have the team that not only finished on top of the conference, but the team that survived and made its way to the finals, the Los Angeles Lakers. In the offseason prior, Kobe Bryant was frustrated with the team's lack of success post-Shaquille O'Neal and publicly stated that he wanted to be traded from LA. Soon after, there was an agreement in place that would have sent him to Detroit, but the Pistons weren't on his list of preferred destinations. Kobe, who had a no-trade clause, nixed the deal with the hope that he'd be able to end up somewhere better. That never happened, and he was somehow still a Laker heading into the 2008 season. Most analysts expected more of the same from LA heading into the season, a fringe playoff team that would only go as far as Kobe dragged them. However, they didn't take into account all of the small things that the Lakers did to build quite a formidable team. They brought back Derek Fisher, who was already well familiar with Phil Jackson's system, and also saw Andrew Bynum make a big leap, becoming a truly high-quality starting center. This led the Lakers from ascension to mediocrity to competency, as they were the 4th seed in the West through February. However, a season-ending injury to Bynum meant that their season was in jeopardy. The team went just 3-5 in the first 8 games after getting the news, and things were looking rocky to say the least. Not wanting to waste another one of Kobe's prime years, the team swung for the fences and traded for Pau Gasol. This brought the team from good to great, as they went 22-5 down the stretch to snag the first seed with 57 wins. It led to Kobe winning the sole MVP of his career, as he finally had a good team around him during his absolute peak. He then carried this momentum into the postseason, where he averaged 35-5 to get the Lakers back into the finals, where they would eventually fall to the Celtics in 6 games. Even though they didn't end the season raising the trophy, finishing at the top and making it out of the most competitive conference in the history of the league should not be taken lightly. And it wasn't like the deck was stacked in LA's favor. Sure, they had the benefit of acquiring Pau Gasol for pretty much nothing, but they also had to learn to play with him on the fly in the middle of the season, on top of being down 2 rotation pieces in Bynum and Trevor Ariza. And with the way that the standings took form, they had to probably play the 2 best teams besides them in their own conference, as the Jazz and Spurs were both amazing that year. I'm not saying that Kobe is the greatest player ever or anything, but if we want to give LeBron credit for making out of the East all those years, when he was going up against teams like the Bobcats, the Nate Robinson-led Bulls, then Kobe deserves credit for surviving this absolute battleground that was the 2008 Western Conference. And that's all I have for you guys today. If you don't think this is the greatest conference ever like I do, let me know in the comments which one you think is better. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys in the next video.